Hello, everyone. Welcome to Easy English Spark, your ultimate home for English listening and speaking skills. Over the next videos, we'll explore our 10-chapter adventure from the floating cradle all the way to homeward flight. Each chapter gives you short story scenes to sharpen pronunciation, expand vocabulary, and speak with newfound confidence. Grab your notebook, settle in, and let's spark up your English, chapter by chapter, word by word. Ready? Let's dive in. Chapter 1. The Floating Cradle. I remember the night as if the salt-tinged wind were still tugging at my shawl, and the lantern's glass were still fogging beneath my breath. The town of Brighton lay asleep behind me, rows of slate rooftops slick, with dew, shutters rattling softly whenever the breeze crept in from the channel. But I was wide awake, waiting on the timber pier for my husband's return. Every morning before dawn, Graham sets sail aboard our little cutter, the North Star, dragging his net in a wide arc beyond the harbor mouth. Usually I greet him with a mug of steaming tea and a fresh coil of rope. But that morning my lantern cast a restless, fluttering halo across the waves, as though it knew some other cargo would arrive. Out on the water, the eastern sky ripened from charcoal to violet. The lighthouse on the headland winked its final warning before giving way to the first pale ember of dawn. That was when I spotted the silhouette of our boat, sails slack, drifting rather than slicing forward. At once I felt something unsettled in my chest. Not fear exactly, but the sense that the familiar rhythm of our lives was about to shift. Graham raised a hand in greeting as he coasted alongside the pier. Instead of the usual brisk smile, he wore an expression I could not read, half wonder, half alarm. He knotted the mooring line with unsteady fingers, then beckoned me aboard with a wordless tilt of his head. Sea spray stung my cheeks as I climbed over the gunwale, and the deck pitched underfoot. Fish still flopped in tangled loops of netting, but what drew my gaze was the basket nestled among them, as out of place as moonlight in a quarry. It was an oval cradle woven from river reeds, bleached to palest ivory, its rim stitched with narrow ribbons of kelp that glimmered wetly. Tiny glass beads, clear as tears, had been threaded into the weave so that the whole basket shimmered whenever it shifted. Graham knelt beside it, touching the lid as though the slightest pressure might splinter dream from reality. My breath caught when I heard the softest sigh rise from within. He peeled back a corner of damp linen, and there he was, a newborn no bigger than a haddock, wrapped in a blanket the color of cloud light. His skin glowed alabaster pale, and a single curl of ebony hair fell over his brow. I had seen infants before, neighbors' babies bundled up against the cold, but this boy seemed carved from something finer than flesh. Even asleep, his eyelids quivered as though they were listening to distant music. A faint, salty scent clung to him, not of sweat or milk, but of deep ocean tides. Found him tangled in the net, Graham whispered hoarsely. He was floating, Mira, just floating there. No wreckage, no boat, no sign of an accident at all. I brushed my fingers across the infant's cheek. Warm, steady, alive. In the hush that hung between us and the gulls overhead, I felt the universe hinge upon that tiny heartbeat. A fisherman and his wife, childless after years of hoping, had been handed a miracle packaged in seaweed. We lifted the cradle clear of the fish and set it in the prow, where dawn light now poured across the rails. Graham raised the mainsail without another word, and the fabric caught a sudden eager gust that hurried us toward shore. Every wave that slapped against the hull seemed to call, "Hush-a-bye, hush-a-bye," as though the sea itself were singing the boy home. By the time we tied off at the pier, the town had begun to stir. Smoke curling from chimneys, fishmongers rattling, barrows along the cobblestones and bakery windows glowing gold. We carried the cradle through those waking streets, heads bowed, as neighbors paused mid-gossip or mid-yawn to stare after us. Some murmured blessings, some crossed themselves, and more than one child pointed, wide-eyed, before being hustled indoors by a bewildered mother. When our cottage door closed behind us, warmth washed over my face, the smell of peat fire and rosemary bread. Graham cleared a space beside the hearth and laid the cradle there, out of reach of sparks. I knelt again, unable to resist lifting the infant into my arms. The moment his weight settled against me, a maternal earthquake split my heart wide. I had never carried life inside me, but in that instant I knew I would guard his with every breath I drew. He blinked awake, gray eyes focusing on the dancing flames as though he already understood their story. Then he turned his gaze on me, and the room fell silent except for the slow crackle of burning logs. My voice emerged in a hush. "Welcome home, little traveler." I rocked him gently, humming a lullaby my own mother used to sing when winter storms battered the shutters. Graham knelt beside me, rough hands brushing the baby's swaddling. He cleared his throat. "We should give him a name." My gaze drifted to the window, where sunrise had finally broken full. A band of radiant gold lighting the froth on the tide flats. The child's blanket caught that same glow, turning silver to soft flame. "Leo," I said, like the sun climbing the horizon, brave and bright. Graham repeated it, tasting the syllable. "Leo Wells." His eyes shone with unspoken prayers. Our son. The announcement felt like striking a match, sudden, irrevocable, lighting parts of my heart I didn't know existed. No certificate, no midwife, no village council was required. The sea had delivered him. The sea had chosen us. All that morning, we prepared a place for Leo. Graham constructed a cradle from pine planks left over from boat repairs, smoothing every edge, tightening every peg, polishing until the wood shone. I stitched linen into swaddling cloths and brewed a thin barley water to soften a drop of goat's milk. We had no rattle or toy, so I strung 3 seashells on a ribbon and hung them above the new cradle. Their hollow whispers lulled the air. Whenever a draft passed through, news travels faster than tide in Brighton. By noon, the village square buzzed. Old Mrs. Pendry arrived first, pressing a jar of honey and a knitted cap into my hands. The blacksmith's apprentice followed, offering a horseshoe for luck. Even the taciturn harbor master doffed his cap and muttered that any lad who survived the open sea on his first night deserved free mooring for life. I thanked them all, but it was Leo they came to see. He obliged each visitor with patient, unblinking solemnity, as though he were cataloging the human world before committing to it fully. Later, after the bustle had waned, I rocked him beside the hearth, studying the curve of his ear, the faint pulse at his temple. I found a tiny birthmark there, shaped like the crescent of a waxing moon. Barely visible but unmistakable once discovered. I traced it gently, marveling. "Look at that," Graham whispered, kneeling behind me. A sailor's moon, right on his brow. Maybe the sea marked him so we'd never doubt where he came from. Neither of us spoke the fears that hovered at the edges of candlelight. Who sets a child afloat alone? Was he abandoned or rescued? Would someone come looking? But whenever those questions clawed at my mind, I reminded myself of the warmth in my arms, the trust in those storm-gray eyes. Whatever had happened before this dawn was lost to the depths. Our duty was now and forward. Evening gathered. The bay, gulls' cries faded to distant echoes, and the tide slipped out, revealing rippled sandbars that glimmered like hammered bronze. I laid Leo in his new cradle, tucked the seashell mobile so it whispered him to sleep, and watched his fingers curl around the edge of the blanket. Graham rested a hand on my shoulder. For the first time since he hauled that net aboard, I saw exhaustion drain from his face, replaced by something like purpose. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "I'll register him at the parish, buy goats, milk from the Franklin farm, and ask Dr. Shaw to look him over. We'll do everything right, Mira." I I nodded, though tears blurred the cradle's outline. Yes, we'll be the parents he was meant to find. Outside, the surf murmured against breakwater stones, steady, patient, eternal. Inside, the fire popped, throwing petals of orange light across Leo's sleeping features. I listened to the new rhythm of our home, the clock's tick, the baby's soft breathing, and my own heart answering both. I thought of how life can pivot on a single heartbeat, how love can wash ashore without warning, and how a floating cradle can carry not just a child, but the entire future of two ordinary souls. That is how our story begins. Not with triumph or tragedy, but with wonder. Wonder that the sea, in all its fathomless mystery, chose us to anchor this tiny voyager. And as I draw the shutters against nightfall, I vow that no storm, no gossip, no shadow of doubt will take him from us. Leo Wells, child of dawn and tide, has come home. Chapter 2. The Happy Harbor. I often tell people that Brighton's harbor is really a living room. The sea is the hearth. The gulls are the chattering children on the rug, and every boat is a rocking chair that knows exactly where it belongs. Once Leo entered our lives, that living room seemed to stretch its walls just wide enough to fit a brand new soul. The first summer of his infancy arrived in ribbons of blue, cobalt at dawn, turquoise at noon, indigo at dusk. I would sling Leo to my chest in a woven carrier and walk the quay while Graham mended nets beside me. Tar, salt, and fresh-cut rope laced the air. Fishermen called greetings. Morning, Mira, the little moon calf still sleeping? He's up, I'd answer, lightly bouncing so Leo could see the sparkle on the waves. He never wants to miss the sunrise. At 6 months, he recognized the creak of cleats, the slap of halyards against masts, and the distant hiss of surf on shingle. When these sounds mingled, his eyelids fluttered in peaceful recognition, the same way other babies quiet at a lullaby. The harbor's heartbeat had become his own, the seasons of learning. Autumn, year 1. The gulls molted and the wind sharpened. Graham fashioned a tiny oilskin coat, soft enough not to rub Leo's ears but sturdy against spray. On calm afternoons, he balanced our crawling boy on the thwart of the North Star, hands cupped around Leo's waist. "This is port, lad. That's starboard," he'd say, tapping left, then right. It didn't matter that Leo couldn't yet walk. Graham believed that teaching a child sea terms early was as natural as teaching him to clap. Winter, year 2. Frost etched white ferns across the cottage panes. Indoors, I spread sailcloth scraps on the floor and let Leo crawl over them while I darned. He dragged a wooden spoon across the canvas, tracing imaginary coastlines. When the fire popped, he laughed every time, somehow convinced the sparks were friendly sprites leaping for joy. Spring, Year 3. Wild primroses quilted the cliffside. Leo, now toddling, insisted on helping deliver Graham's catch to the market. He would grasp the end of a wicker basket and toddle beside me, nearly knocked over by the weight of mackerel. Fishwives cooed, pinched his cheeks, slipped him sugared plums. "Born of the tide, that one," they'd say, and Leo would grin, plum juice streaking down his chin like war paint. Friends, feasts, and first adventures. By 5, he was friend to every stray dog and every lighthouse keeper. He could untie a reef knot faster than many deckhands twice his age. On market days, he perched atop fish barrels, swinging his heels while telling wide-eyed stories about mermaids who quilt clouds from sea foam. None of the children doubted him. Something in Leo's gray gaze made magic feel probable. The harbor holds a street feast every midsummer. Long tables stretch end to end, laden with crab pies, nettle soup, and treacle tarts. Lanterns bob on strings overhead like upside-down fireflies. That year, Leo announced he would perform a secret trick. We indulged him, expecting a song. Instead, he produced 3 pebbles, painted bright red, and tried to keep them aloft in a wobbling triangle. They clacked, tumbled, rolled under tables. He bowed anyway, utterly unembarrassed, and the crowd applauded twice as loud for the attempt as they would have for perfection. It was my first glimpse of the performer hiding inside our seaside boy. Storms that strengthen. When Leo turned 8, the worst gale in a decade clawed across the channel. Roof slates flew like skipping stones, waves hammered the breakwater and snapped 2 mooring posts clean in half. Graham and I anchored the North Star as best we could, then huddled in the cottage listening to windows groan. At the height of the tempest, Leo slipped from our arms, crossed to the door, and pressed his palm against the trembling latch. "Listen," he whispered. We heard only wind, but he insisted, "The sea doesn't mean to frighten us. It's just singing too loud." That night, he fell asleep beside the hearth, one hand resting on the seashell mobile I'd hung years before. The next morning, half the town gathered for repairs. Leo wove among the adults, passing nails, fetching hammers, hauling stray planks with serious concentration. Wherever he worked, laughter surfaced through fatigue, as though he carried a pocket full of calm he could sprinkle on anyone who needed. Its small voyages, big dreams. At 10, Graham took Leo on his first dawn crossing past the headland. I watched from shore as the cutter dwindled to a chalk-white fleck. When they returned at noon, Graham's voice rang down the pier, equal parts pride and wonder. He charted our whole course on a scrap of parchment. Tides, wind, landmarks, not a degree off. Leo blushed at the praise, but confessed later that his secret had been observation. The sea leaves clues on the waves like footprints in sand. You've only to read them. By 12, he knew every star above Brighton, could splice rope in 3 different patterns, and had begun to refurbish an abandoned dinghy for his personal explorations. On quiet evenings, he and I would sit at the cottage table, lantern between us, sketching new sail designs while Graham recited legends of lost islands paved in pearls. Leo never scoffed. He stored each tale as carefully as any navigational chart. The harbor, as classroom school lessons happened too. Ink-blotted copybooks and multiplication drills in a stone building near the churchyard. But Leo's real education flowed straight from the quay. The cooper taught him barrel making. The net weaver showed him how to twist flax so fine it floated. The apothecary let him taste brine-tolerant herbs. One afternoon, the town bell clanged in alarm. A visiting merchant had slipped between ship and jetty, breaking 2 ribs. While adults panicked, Leo ducked beneath the crowd, retrieved a plank for a stretcher, and guided the sailor to the infirmary with brisk, gentle orders. Dr. Shaw later told us the quick thinking likely saved a punctured lung. I recall standing in the surgery doorway, watching Leo adjust the bandage wrap, his brow furrowed in quiet command. In that moment, I realized the harbor had done more than raise him. It had already begun to rely on him. Foreshadow on the wind on. Leo's 16th birthday, a brisk March morning jeweled with gull cries, he lingered alone on the breakwater long after the nets were stowed. I joined him, pulling my shawl tight. "What do you see out there?" I asked. "Possibility," he murmured. The word drifted like smoke above the foam. And something else, as if a thread is tugging from beyond the horizon. I thought it teenage fancy, but a shiver chased my spine. For the first time, I sensed that the harbor, though happy, might not be large enough to keep him forever. A harbor in harmony. Still, that year hummed with contentment. Sunrise breakfasts of oat cakes and plum jam, twilight toes in lukewarm surf, laughter bouncing between cottages during impromptu fiddle dances. Leo helped paint hulls, repaired lighthouse lenses, and coached younger children through their first rowing strokes. Everyone called him Harbor Bright, a nickname he pretended to dislike but secretly treasured. Some evenings he practiced that old pebble juggling trick, now with polished driftwood balls that Graham carved, until he could keep 3, then 4 aloft. When one clattered to the stones, he'd shrug. Gravity's just shy. Give it time. The chapter closes, the door opens, and so Brighton thrummed through the seasons, a tapestry of creels and catboats, gull wings and church bells, with Leo woven into every strand. Had you walked our quay in those days, you'd have seen a young man balancing on a bollard, arms outstretched, eyes reflecting both water and sky, though perhaps you would not have guessed which of the two he felt drawn to more. None of us suspected that a crimson-sailed clipper was already charting a course toward our snug harbor, its arrival destined to alter everything we thought we understood about fate, talent, and the sea's true intentions. But that is a tale for another time. For now, remember Brighton as it was then, a harbor so joyous that even the tides seemed to linger, reluctant to depart. And at its shining center stood Leo, child of the cradle, heart of the waves, perfectly at home, yet already listening for a distant call only he could hear. Chapter 3. The Enigmatic Tumbler. The morning that forever altered the rhythm of our harbor began with nothing more extraordinary than a blush of coral light on slate-gray water. It was early April, Leo's 16th year, and a spring tide had tugged the sea farther out than usual, exposing ribbons of glistening sand. From the garden I watched him stride along the breakwater, boots sloshing through puddles, arms swinging in that loose, confident gait he'd borrowed from gulls on an updraft. He was supposed to be checking lobster pots with Graham, yet I sensed he needed silence more than company. Some boys that age wrestle with clumsy limbs. Leo wrestled with ideas too large for any shoreline. His eyes kept drifting past the horizon as though someone were whispering from beyond it. I returned to kneading bread, half listening for the familiar crunch of footsteps on the path. What I heard instead was a ripple of whistles and shouts, an excitement that rolled up the hill in waves. The cottage windows rattled with hurried knocks. Old Mrs. Pendry stuck her head through the kitchen door without apology. "Clipper in the bay," she cried, cheeks flushed. "Never seen her colors before. Sails red as rowan berries, figurehead like a gilded swan. The whole town's gathering." I wiped flour from my hands and ran. By the time I reached the quay, the vessel dominated the harbor like a crimson star fallen to earth. 3 towering masts, yards gleaming, ropes humming in the light breeze. On deck, sailors in indigo jackets secured lines with the practiced grace of dancers. But it was the man at the prow who snared every eye. He stood tall, perhaps in his late 30s, Hair the shade of midnight ink swept back from a sharp brow. His coat, black velvet trimmed with silver thread, fitted him as a second skin. In each gloved hand he held a wooden club studded with brass knobs, and before speech or greeting he began to juggle. 1, 2, 3, 4 clubs spun skyward in a flashing arc, crossing and recrossing with precise music box timing. Gasps popped along the wharf like corks. Leo stepped forward until his boots touched the water's edge. The stranger's gaze slid from spinning clubs to the boy's upturned face. A quick smile curved across his features, as if recognizing a secret code. Without warning, the clubs froze midair on the apex of their flight, hung impossibly suspended, like sparrows caught in amber. The crowd cried out. With a slow twist of his wrist, the stranger plucked each club from the sky, set them upright in a perfect line beside his polished boots, and bowed. Only then did he speak, voice carrying without strain. "Brighton folk," he said, "allow me to offer my name. Cassian Vale, Master Tumbler and Conductor of Wonders. For 3 nights my troupe and I shall perform on the tide flats at dusk, if your good mayor permits, of course." The mayor, a stout man determined never to look surprised, adjusted his waistcoat and gave consent before anyone thought to refuse. Cassian inclined his head, then spread his arms wide. Sailors lowered a gangplank carpeted in indigo cloth. He disembarked with the effortless glide of someone born on theater boards rather than planks. Children surged forward. Their mothers snatched them back. Fishermen whispered of gypsies, illusionists, even highwaymen. I felt none of their caution, only the odd certainty that we'd waited years for this precise moment. Cassian paced the pier, greeting townsfolk with a courteous nod, but when he reached Leo, he stopped. The pause lasted the span of a heartbeat, yet in that instant, the harbor held its breath. Cassian's dark eyes studied the youth as an astronomer might study a newly discovered star. "Leo Wells," he said softly, pronouncing the name as though tasting a fine wine. "Child of the tides," Leo blinked. "How do you know who I am?" Cassian's smile deepened, revealing a dimple that made him look suddenly boyish. "The wind keeps a generous gossip column, my young friend." She spoke of a lad who reads waves like scripture and threads driftwood through the air as though gravity were optional. It embarrassed Leo to be flattered so openly, yet his curiosity flared brighter than modesty. "You suspended those clubs?" "No." "Mirror? No strings. Was it—" "A matter of timing," Cassian interjected, "and understanding what the world expects, so you may politely decline." Before Leo could reply, Cassian clapped once, sharp as a pistol crack. From the ship's hold rolled barrels of equipment, followed by acrobats in teal tabards, ribbon, dancers balancing scarlet hoops, and a somber man lugging an iron-bound chest that clinked ominously. The troop fanned across the wharf, turning ordinary boards into a proscenium. Drums rumbled. A flute stitched high notes above the gull cries. Cassian raised a single finger. The music halted. "Forgive the intrusion upon your morning labors," he announced, "but consider this a taste of tonight's banquet." With that, he sprang into motion. Literally sprang. Ankles coiling, then releasing, so he vaulted onto a piling 6 feet high. From there he flipped backward, landing atop a fish barrel without so much as a wobble. Applause burst, spontaneous and wild. He accepted it briefly, then beckoned Leo with a curl of gloved fingers. "Would you lend me your pocket knife?" Cassian asked. Puzzled, Leo produced the small blade he always carried for rope work. Cassian snapped it open, balanced it on his chin, and executed a slow-turning pirouette. Gasps became cheers when he flipped forward, tossed the knife skyward, and arm, darting like a snake, caught it by the safe edge, snapping it shut in one fluid motion. He returned it with a flourish. "A tool may serve many crafts," he said. "Your hand already knows. Would you like to see what else it can master?" A hush fell so complete I heard the tide licking barnacles beneath the pier. Leo's answer slid out in barely a whisper. "Yes." That evening, Graham and I sat on the cottage steps, stunned by the day's events. The setting sun painted the clipper's sails ruby red. Torches flickered along the shoreline where workers raised a makeshift amphitheater out of driftwood planks. It felt as though a traveling kingdom had anchored beside our humble village. Graham rubbed calloused palms on his trousers. "I don't trust him," he muttered. "Anyone who makes objects hover could make truth do the same." "He hasn't asked for payment," I reminded him. "Maybe he's just extraordinary." Graham snorted, though not unkindly. Extraordinary folk often carry a price no coin can meet. Night settled. Stars pricked open like silver pins. At twilight's last blush, we joined the townspeople filing onto the broad tide flat. Lanterns hung from oiled hemp poles, swaying in the salt breeze. A stage, half-circle low to the sand, waited, draped in midnight blue velvet. The show began with tumblers cartwheeling through rings of fire, ribbon dancers drawing spirals of glowing paint in the air, and a contortionist folding himself into a copper birdcage no larger than a laundry basket. Each feat elicited roars, yet everyone knew they waited for Cassian's finale. He appeared center stage wearing a new coat, white brocade embroidered with constellations in cobalt thread. In silence, he lit 4 torches, one by one, their flames flaring orange, then settling into steady tongues of blue. He tossed them skyward, the torchlight braided above his head in complex, hypnotic loops. Then, swift as gulls drop for fish, he beckoned Leo from the front row. I felt Graham's fingers dig into my arm. "No," he rasped, under breath. But Leo was already stepping onto the stage, barefoot on cool sand. Cassian pressed a hand to the boy's shoulder. "Trust the rhythm," I heard him murmur. He handed Leo a single unlit torch. With a flint spark, it bloomed to life. Cassian guided the boy's wrist through a simple arc, then another. Soon 2 torches circled between them, crossing in perfect tempo. The third joined the pattern, then the 4th. My heart hammered as flame whirled, inches from Leo's hair. Yet his face showed only fierce concentration and, yes, delight. Cassian released his grip and stepped back. Leo, alone, kept the 4 blazing batons cycling through smoky air, faster, higher. Gasps melted into awed silence. Even the sea seemed to hush its breathing. When at last he caught each torch and dropped to one knee, applause thundered loud enough to shake gulls from pilings. Cassian helped him stand and announced so all could hear, "Ladies and gentlemen, you have witnessed the birth of a prodigy." Behind the roar, I felt something else rise. A current, half pride, half dread. As the cheers died away, Cassian addressed the audience with formal gravity. "I will remain 3 days. During that time, I invite young Leo Wells to train under my supervision. Let him decide if he wishes to chart a course beyond this harbor, but know that the world beyond awaits his gifts." He bowed. Curtains of velvet fell. Torches guttered out. The crowd dispersed in buzzing knots, exclaiming what they had seen. Graham stood rigid beside me, fists clenched. "He cannot go," he said. "He might need to," I replied, although the words stung my tongue. That night, Leo sat by the hearth twisting one of Graham's carved driftwood balls between his fingers. Firelight painted flickers across his thoughtful expression. "Cassian says I could learn aerial silks, balance knives on violin strings, dance on ropes thinner than fishing line," he whispered. "Imagine, Mother, sailing not just oceans but possibilities." "I imagine danger," I told him honestly. and missing you so fiercely the cottage walls will ache. But I would return, he promised. Better, wiser. I could bring stories worthy of Brighton, perhaps gold enough to mend every leaking roof on this coast. In my heart, I heard newborn Leo's first breath, felt the weight of the cradle in my arms. Yet I also saw the boy on stage, surrounded by flame yet untouched, as though destiny shielded him. We have 3 days, I said softly. Let us weigh our hopes against our fears in equal measure. He nodded, placed the driftwood ball on the mantel, and kissed my brow. I watched him climb the stairs, tall now, shoulders squared by secret music. When the latch clicked, Graham emerged from the shadowed doorway. I won't lose him to a vagabond, he said. Or to the smallness of our love, I answered. We must decide which prison is worse. Neither of us slept. Outside, the clippers, masts traced dark lines against a crescent moon, as if the night itself had stitched a question mark upon the sky, waiting for 3 short days to unveil the answer. Chapter 4. The Gentle Proposal. Morning drifted in on wings of pearl-gray cloud, and I woke to the soft percussion of gulls tapping the roof slates. My first thought was of the man in the silver-trimmed coat and the hush that had settled over the audience the night before. My second was of Leo, still asleep upstairs, though whether he dreamed of flaming torches or rolling waves I could not guess. I brewed tea strong enough to stand a spoon in. Graham sat opposite me at the scrubbed pine table, turning the chipped rim of his mug again and again. The silence between us felt thick as net rope. It's day 1, he muttered at last. I understood. Cassian Vale had said 3 days. 3 days for conversation, persuasion, decision. A tide that would not wait. Just then the latch lifted and the door swung open without so much as a polite knock. Cassian stood framed by the threshold, morning light flaring around him like a halo someone had misplaced. He removed his hat, a gesture so courtly I almost expected a Renaissance lute to begin playing. Forgive the intrusion, he said, voice low and unhurried. The shoreline made no mention of visiting hours. Graham bristled but managed a nod. I poured another cup. Thank you, Cassian said, accepting the steaming mug as though it were the finest porcelain. I prefer my tea honest, and my intentions the same. May we speak? He took the chair closest to the hearth, positioning himself not at the head of the table but at its side, as if to say, I sit with you, not across from you. It was a minor choreography, yet I recognized it for what it was. the first beat of a carefully staged act. Graham cleared his throat. "Say what you came to say." Cassian gazed into the fire before answering, as though conferring with the flames. When he looked up, his eyes were gentler than I remembered from the stage. "Your son carries an aptitude that appears once in perhaps a generation," he began. "Balance, timing, the instinctive understanding that every object spun through. Air is a conversation with gravity. I do not flatter you, nor him. I state a fact, the way sailors recite the tide tables." Graham's fingers tightened around his mug. "A fact, is it? Facts wear numbers. Measure Leo's worth in hours away from home, lost dinners, letters we may never receive, and the price feels dear." Cassian inclined his head. "Which is why the decision must come from love, not fear. I offer a compact, 1 year and 1 day of tutelage. At its end, Leo may choose his path, my deck or your dockside, and I will abide by that choice without argument." The phrase 1 year and 1 day rang inside me like a church bell struck twice. Children's fables used that measure for quests and curses, swearing it held special power. I wondered how many parents before us had faced the same phrase and felt the same tremor. Before Graham could reply, the loft ladder creaked. Leo descended barefoot, hair a storm of dark curls, eyes bright with restless dawn. He halted on the last rung, reading the room in a single glance. "Mum? Dad?" Then to Cassian, "Is this about me?" "Pull up a chair, lad," Graham said gruffly. "Seems a man has designs on your future." Leo dropped onto the bench beside me. Cassian repeated his proposal, word for word, but this time his voice wrapped each syllable in soft velvet. I watched Leo's pupils widen, saw hope and terror jostle like sparrows in his chest. Graham pushed back from the table. "Let's test your honesty, Mr. Vale. What do you gain by training my son?" Cassian steepled his fingers. "An apprentice who may one day surpass his master, which is every master's secret immortality. Also companionship. Stage life is less lonely when brilliance keeps pace." Graham frowned. "And coin? Where does money fit into this paragon of mentorship?" Cassian allowed himself a small smile. "I will cover every expense. Wardrobe, food, medicine, travel. At the year's end, Leo keeps any wages earned from performances. Consider it a dowry of adventure." Graham looked to me. I answered with a slight tilt of my head. We both heard sincerity, yet sincerity could be rehearsed. "Words are cheap," Graham said, "but signatures hold weight. Draft your terms. We'll read them by lamplight." Cassian rose. I anticipated as much. From his coat he withdrew a folded parchment, beeswax seal unbroken. Peruse it at leisure. Return it signed, or scorched if you prefer, by the third sunset. He placed the document on the table like a gift only courage could open, then offered Leo a respectful nod. I have rehearsal on the tide flat. If curiosity outpaces caution, my door is ajar. With another hat tilt he left, boots clicking. Once, twice, gone. The room felt bigger for his absence. Leo traced the wax seal with trembling fingers. May I? After chores, Graham said, stern but not unkind. He rose, fetched his coat, and thumped out to the garden, leaving the door. Ajar so sea air rushed in like a spectator hungry for gossip. The hours that followed crawled and sprinted by turns. Leo scrubbed decking boards until they gleamed, carried buckets of seawater for the lobster pots, and chopped a stack of driftwood too knotted for my taste. His body did the work, but his thoughts chased torches across unseen skies. When noon bells tolled, I called him inside for bread and smoked herring. He washed, then broke his crust in contemplative silence. Mum, he said finally, you once told me every gift comes with a shadow. Does the shadow here belong to Cassian or to me? I brushed a crumb from his lip. Shadows belong where light strikes brightest. Yours may lengthen, but it won't define you. He chewed on that, both bread and words, then slipped the parchment from the mantel where I had hidden it. We read side by side, line by line. The contract was astonishingly plain. No trick clauses, no forfeit of rights. It promised safe lodging, 3 square meals, weekly letters delivered through ship's courier, and immediate return should illness arise. At journey's end, choice fell solely to Leo. The only unusual stipulation lay in fine italics. The apprentice must bring with him one object of home, to be kept near at all times. I couldn't decide if the sentence was charming or ominous. By dusk, Graham returned, smelling of seaweed and resolve. He took the paper, lit the oil lamp, and read it thrice. Then he fetched a quill, but instead of signing, he wrote a fresh clause beneath the last. Parents may visit once, unannounced at their own expense, to confirm well-being. He sanded the wet ink, folded the parchment, and slid it into Leo's trembling hands. If Vale accepts this addendum, Graham said, my objections shrink, not vanish, but shrink. Leo hugged him so fiercely I feared ribs might crack. Graham's arms responded after a startled beat, closing around the boy he'd fished from the deep years before. Sunset bled magenta over water as we walked toward the tide-flat amphitheater. Lanterns were being lit, one by one, until the shoreline resembled a necklace of glowing pearls. Cassian waited near the gangplank, coat now midnight blue. I noticed how he glanced first at Leo, second at us. This, too, was choreography. Acknowledge the jewel before the setting, lest anyone doubt its luster. Graham handed over the parchment. With an addition, he said. Cassian unfolded it, brows lifting only slightly as he read. Without looking up, he produced a fountain pen, signed beneath our script, and handed the contract back, now complete. A reasonable request, he said. Parents should see horizons, too. Relief loosened a knot I hadn't known lodged in my chest. Graham, however, wasn't done. Another matter, he said. You juggle risks as easily as clubs, but if my son comes to harm, Cassian raised a palm. You have my word. I safeguard him as fiercely as if he were blood. His tone held no flourish. It sounded like iron wrapped in silk. The contract sealed, he turned to Leo. Tomorrow, dawn on deck. Bring whatever piece of home feels truest. Leo nodded, eyes shining. I know exactly what to take. That night, the cottage glowed with candle stubs burned too low. We packed a small canvas bag, 3 shirts, 2 breeches, a journal, and the driftwood juggling balls Graham had carved. At the last moment, Leo added a coil of twisted straw. The very scrap of reed basket that had once been his cradle. He'd kept the piece tucked in a seaman's locker all these years. Seeing it, now I pressed my hand to my mouth, overwhelmed by the circle drawing closed. He noticed my tears, pulled me into an embrace. I will come back, Mum. I know, I said, though faith and fear braided tight enough to sting. Graham stood apart, whittling a scrap of pine into shavings that spiraled to the floor. Finally, he stepped forward and placed a brass compass in Leo's palm. Its lid shone, dull with years of use. Belonged to your grandfather, he said. Needles may point north, but hearts point home. Leo's voice caught. Thank you. We slept little, speaking in whispers whenever the wind rattled shutters. Before dawn's first blush, Leo dressed in the silence of bedrooms that felt suddenly smaller. I tied back his hair with a strip of sailcloth, the one I'd embroidered with a tiny gull when he was 10. He slung the canvas bag over his shoulder, kissed my forehead, and descended the ladder. Graham and I followed him to the gate. The harbor stretched ahead, masts etched black against a pale sky, water bruised purple before sunrise. Cassian waited at the gangplank, silhouette framed by lantern glow. Beside him, his troop carried crates and coils of velvet rope. Leo paused beside the garden fence. He touched the weathered wood as if memorizing the grain under his fingertips. Then he turned, raised 2 fingers to his brow in a salute that was half sailor's, half showman's, and walked toward new waters. We watched until the clippers, crimson sails bellied full, and the anchor lifted with a groan we felt in our teeth. The ship slipped from its berth, carving a V of white foam that widened and then erased itself behind her wake. A long hush fell. The gulls, respectful, kept to distant thermals. Sea air tasted different, sweet and raw at once. Graham's hand found mine. 1 year and 1 day, he said. I nodded, tears cooling on my cheeks like dew. And then we'll see what the tide returns. As the sun breached the horizon, a single shaft of gold caught the ship's highest spar, making it blaze like a star-setting sail. I chose to believe it was an omen of safe passage, a gentle promise whispered across water. Chapter 5. Wings Above the Waves. The dawn after Leo sailed away, I found my world both emptier and infinitely larger. I could no longer see my son from the window, yet every tide line and cloud bank seemed to carry a hint of his future. I began to keep a journal of his letters and the stories they contained, piecing them together with the memories he later shared. What follows is the voyage as I have come to know it. Half ink on paper, half breath traded at our hearth on winter nights. Long afterward, I first days at sea. Leo's earliest letter arrived on parchment that smelled of tar and oranges. He wrote by moonlight, he said, because Cassian insisted that the night sky makes a finer ceiling than any cabin roof. Training began before sunrise, stretches on the mid-deck, rope climbs up the mainmast, then footwork drills along a painted line no wider than a gull's wing. Mist soaked their hair and lashes until each apprentice glimmered like a pearl. Cassian calls it listening to the wind, Leo scrawled. Not hearing, listening. He says every gust carries a rhythm, and if we match our breath to it, balance becomes second nature. Graham reread that line twice, muttering, "Wind is for filling sails, not filling heads." But I saw pride soften the corners of his eyes. By the end of the first week, Leo could cartwheel the full length of the quarterdeck without rattling a single plank. By the second, he had mastered a 3-club cascade while walking backward up a ratline. Cassian watched in silence, then nodded once, the highest praise he ever offered in public. The troop. Beyond Cassian, the ship teemed with performers, who felt part crew, part constellation, Aurora Finch, aerial silk dancer, spun crimson ribbons from the mizzen yard, her laughter floating higher than gulls. Jax Corbett, illusionist, could flick a silver coin through solid oak and pluck it from a stranger's ear moments later. Naima al-Shahir, fire choreographer, taught Leo how to breathe flame without blistering his lips. Her desert accent rolled like distant drums. Izumi Sato, quartermaster and contortionist, cataloged every rope coil by day and folded herself into a teak chest by night to keep the others guessing. Each afternoon, they traded skills the way sailors trade tall tales. Leo learned to knot silks into safety harnesses and, on a dare, balanced upside down on Aurora's shoulders while the clipper pitched through a squall. In return, he showed them how to splice fishing lines so fine it vanished in daylight, and how to predict a change of weather from the taste of the air alone. Ports of Lisbon greeted them first. Hillside streets bright with fado songs and laundry like patchwork sails. The troupe performed in a plaza rimmed by lemon trees, torches reflecting in river tiles. Leo wrote that his pulse beat faster than the drums, but when he stepped into the ring, his fear melted like wax. His act lasted only 4 minutes. Club. Juggling on a slackline. But local children followed him for blocks afterward, mimicking every throw. They caught the Mistral into the Mediterranean. In Marseille, he tasted bouillabaisse rich with saffron. In Genoa, he packed his pockets with sea glass for my windowsill. Istanbul dazzled him most. Minarets piercing rose-gold dawn, spice caravanserais humming like beehives. At the Sultan's Spring Festival, he climbed a silk 30 feet high, twisted his body into a human hourglass, and uncoiled with a shout that crossed 3 languages. Cassian announced him as Leo of the Rising Tide. Months later in Brighton, dockhands repeated the title as if it were a legend washed ashore for Storm and Trial. Late autumn, the Bay of Biscay reared up in black fury. Leo's letter describing it arrived water-stained. I imagined him writing with numbed fingers while the ink still wept salt. A rogue wave slewed the ship sideways. Aurora slipped on rain-slicked deck planks and would have gone overboard had Leo not lunged, catching her braid with one hand and the rail with the other. For 10 heartbeats, he wrote, the ocean tried to claim them both. Then Cassian appeared, bracing Leo's shoulders, hauling them clear in a single heave. When the storm eased, Cassian said nothing. He only placed a lantern at the bow, its flame steady in the gale, and returned to the helm. That night, Every performer tied an extra knot in Leo's hammock ropes, a silent vow of gratitude. Letters home. We received a packet every lunar cycle, no more, no less. Graham and I would sit by the fire. I'd read aloud while he quietly mended nets that no longer needed mending. Some passages made us laugh. I tried escargot in Marseille. Turns out snails taste like chewy sea foam. I prefer your haddock pies. Others stole our breath. Tonight Cassian showed me how to step from the bowsprit into thin air, only for half a heartbeat, just long enough to feel the world hesitate before taking me back. But the line that followed every letter, without fail, was, I carry home in my pocket, stitched into every seam. Cassian unveiled. Midwinter off the coast of Alexandria, Cassian invited Leo to the forecastle long past midnight. No other witnesses. Under Orion's belt the two stood side by side, balancing on the bowsprit, arms spread to the horizon. Cassian tipped forward until the toes of his boots hung over nothingness. Leo's gasp caught in his throat, but the captain did not fall. Instead, the ocean rose in a single translucent crest, like glass blown by unseen lungs, cradling Cassian's weight. It held him there, dry-shod, impossible, before laying him gently back on deck. Magic? Leo whispered. Cassian's answer, only the world agreeing to be persuaded. From that night onward, Leo understood that the arts he studied walked the seam where skill ends and wonder begins, and that Cassian guarded the stitches. Ascending. By spring equinox, Leo no. Longer practiced, he composed. He took Aurora's silks, Izumi's contortion frame, Jax's mirrors, and Naima's torches, weaving them into a new routine he titled Wings Above the Waves. Rehearsed under starlight, it began with him suspended upside down from twin ribbons, rowing an invisible current with an oar of fire. Mid-air he unfurled into a spiral, clubs whirling like gulls, then descended to the deck as if stepping down a staircase only he could see. They premiered the piece in Valencia, where fireworks crowned the night like falling constellations. Eyewitnesses swore Leo vanished in a burst of sparks and reappeared atop the town clock tower before the echoes faded. Later he admitted to a concealed pulley, though Cassian only smiled. Homesickness. Triumph could not silence the ache. For Brighton. On quiet watches, Leo traced the grain of his driftwood juggling balls, tasting wood smoke memory. He missed Graham's sea shanties, my rosemary bread, the clink of tide pools at dusk. Once, After a festival in Malta, he slipped away from the revel to sit alone on the breakwater, compass open on his knee. The needle settled, pointing north by northwest, straight through darkness toward home. He followed its arrow in conversation. Almost. There, Mum. Almost there. Nigh. Return route. True to his word, Cassian set the prow west during the final month. They skirted storm cells, rode a kindly Atlantic swell, and sighted Brighton light on the evening of the 366th day. Lanterns lined the breakwater. Our neighbors had stayed awake despite the hour, children wrapped in quilts, elders leaning on canes made slick by sea fog. Graham's arm tightened around my waist as the crimson sails ghosted into view, moonlight gilding their seams. The ship eased alongside the quay without a creak. Cassian stood at the rail, eyes glimmering, candle gold. Leo leapt the gap, landing on the planks he'd walked since toddlerhood, knees soft, smile fierce. Before cheers could rise, he dropped his canvas bag and ran, first to Graham, then to me, lifting me clear off my feet in a hug that smelled of musk, salt, and far-off spices. Reckoning. That night, the Wells cottage glowed with reunion. We laid out-smoked haddock, cinnamon cakes, and a bottle of elderflower wine someone pressed into my palms. Leo's stories tumbled faster than his hands could mimic, each memory sparking another. Yet beneath the brightness I sensed a tension, like a sail still catching covert wind. It surfaced next morning when Cassian knocked, hat in hand. He thanked us for our hospitality, praised Brighton's harbor light, then asked to speak with Leo alone. They walked the length of the beach, footprints braided. When they returned, Leo's eyes were storm gray again. Cassian offers another year, he said softly. Advanced studies, blade dance, high wire above open sea, headline contracts in every capital. A pause. He says greatness glimmers just beyond the step I've taken. Graham's jaw set. My heart lurched, yet neither of us answered. The question hung like mist between cliffs, waiting for wind to choose its direction. Closing the chapter. Before dawn, Cassian's clipper hoisted sail. Whether Leo would be aboard come sunset, none of us yet knew. That decision belonged to the next chapter of our lives. But as I watched the red canvas flare against the pale sky, I whispered a silent truth. Wings can carry us farther than we dream, yet they are stitched first from the breath of those who love us. Leo heard, though perhaps only in the quiet space behind his ribs, and placed his driftwood balls on the windowsill where the rising sun could warm them. Then he sat beside me, compass open, horizon waiting, and together we listened to the tide for our answer. Chapter 6. The Second Departure. I stand at the window, dawn unspooling thread by thread across the slate roofs, and I can already tell the day will taste of decision. Graham has left early to ready the North Star for her own modest voyage. He says the nets need mending, but I know he flees the hush that settled in our cottage overnight. Leo sits at the long oak table, compass open, driftwood balls ranged before him like miniature planets awaiting alignment. I pour tea. The steam rises between us, a veil thin enough to see heartache through. Cassian's offer, spoken and unspoken. Mother, Leo begins, fingers brushing the compass ring. Cassian believes my wings are still half furled. I counter with a soft smile. Birds do not learn every sky at once. Even swifts come home between migrations. He closes the compass. He says there are heights no provincial harbor can show me. A wire stretched between cathedral spires in Prague. A fire dance upon the frozen Neva in winter. A command performance for the Maharaja of Jaipur beneath lanterns made of beaten gold. Cassian's words, magnificent and terrifying, hover in the kitchen like restless moths. I see them reflected in Leo's eyes, little flickers of ambition that deny all lampshades. Graham's ultimatum. Graham returns at noon, sea wind still trapped in his hair. He sets a coil of rope on the bench, each loop coiled with deliberate patience, then meets our son's gaze. 1 year was the bargain, he says, voice low but steady. We honored it. You returned. Our hearth is yours again. Why trade solid ground for deck planks and tempests? Leo answers not with defiance, but with ache. Because I feel the next step rising under my feet, Father, and I'm afraid if I refuse it, the earth will shrink around me. Graham's shoulders sag. He looks suddenly older than his weather lines. Then promise 2 things, he concedes. Write each fortnight without fail, and come home when the contract breaks day 367. Leo nods, tears glossing his lashes. They shake hands like equals, though the tremor in Graham's grip betrays the father beneath the Pact 3. Preparing the soul and the trunk. We spend the week in fevered domestic ballet. I mend Leo's linen shirts with double seams, as if stitches could withstand cannon fire. Graham sharpens a small rigging knife and engraves 2 letters on the handle, LW, though the blade is really for cutting performance silk, not rope. Leo, meanwhile, catalogues moments. He sketches the harbor at dusk, presses a gull feather into his journal, fits the brass compass into a leather pouch. At twilight he walks the breakwater alone and whispers each bollard's rusted "Timmy-tee." I imagine him mapping our shoreline onto the inner walls of his heart, a place he can pace when foreign rooms feel too large. The night before. The eve of departure brings a fragile peace. We dine on sea bass baked in lemon and thyme, Leo's favorite. Between bites he tells us of Izumi's one-armed handstand, of Aurora sewing glow in the dark thread into her silks, of Naima's dream to set a river ablaze without scalding a single fish. When you speak, I tell him, your voice pitches like a sail catching sudden wind. That wind came from home, he replies, touching my wrist. Without you, I'd have lain in driftwood forever. We sit long after the candles gutter, sharing stories we have told before because repetition plates memory in gold. Sunrise on crimson sails. Departure dawn unfolds copper and rose across a sea calm as breath. Cassian's clipper sails freshly, dyed deeper scarlet, hums with the low chant of sailors raising anchor. Townsfolk gather again, but this time their cheers mix with sighs. They know the boy who dazzled them now belongs to broader maps. Cassian waits at the gangplank, coat midnight, gloves ivory, a living eclipse. He bows to Graham and me, less theatrical than courteous. Remember the clause, Graham reminds, tapping the contract in his coat. A visit unannounced. Cassian touches a hand to his heart. My promise holds. Leo turns, catching my gaze. I press a parcel into his grip. Rosemary seeds stitched inside a linen sachet. Plant these somewhere far, I whisper. When they bloom, you'll know part of me lives in that soil. He hugs me tight, breath hitching. Over his shoulder, I glimpse Cassian's expression, something between relief and calculation. The turning tide. The tide pauses, the precise moment when water neither advances nor retreats. In that breath, Leo steps onto the gangplank and gravity tilts. Drums roll. Aurora unfurls a banner that reads, Tour of Transcendent Marvels. Children wave kerchiefs. Elders raise knotted hands. Leo reaches deck, sets his canvas bag beside a coil of line, and lifts one of Graham's driftwood balls skyward. Sunlight catches its whirls. He lets it fall, catches it, repeats, an unspoken vow to keep skill limber. Ropes creak. The ship edges. From the pier, drawing a widening ribbon of water between Leo and home. He stands at the rail, fingers curled around polished wood, compass hung at his throat like a medallion. I raise my arm. Graham salutes with 2 fingers to brow. Leo mirrors the gesture. Then the clipper pivots, sails flowering crimson against blue, and the harbor swallows his silhouette. Silence and echo. We walk back through streets still trembling, with applause. At the cottage I find his tea mug unwashed in the basin, a crescent of pale stain clinging to porcelain. I cannot bear to rinse it yet. Graham drags a chair to the garden and stares at gulls circling the far buoy. Evening brings hush deeper than surf. We sleep fitfully, ears tuned for footsteps that will not arrive. The first letter comes exactly. 2 weeks later, light as dragonfly wings, addressed in a hand-grown surer. Leo writes from Dublin, where he crossed a high wire above the River Liffey during twilight, and felt the city's heart thrum through the cable. He encloses a newspaper clipping. Seafaring aerialist walks the moon's reflection. Graham pins it beside the mantel. Another letter follows from Hamburg, then Helsinki, each a bead on a widening necklace of astonishment. He speaks of theater domes that shimmer like oyster shells, of audiences who sing along to Aurora's ribbon dance, of Cassian meditating on deck during snow. Frayed threads. But come late autumn, the lunar cycle passes with no envelope. Graham shrugs. Weather delays posts, he claims. But I feel a fissure slip through my ribs. A month later, only silence answers. We bribe the harbor master for shipping manifests. Cassian's clipper left Odessa, bound for Marseille, then vanished. From ledgers as if the ink itself were swallowed by fog. Word drifts of a private engagement for a Balkan prince, of a winter tour in St. Petersburg, of a mistimed performance insurance won't cover. Rumors scatter like crows at plow. We clutch whichever lands closest, but none perch long. Graham calls this waiting. Fishing in a pond, you know, is empty. Yet each dawn he scans the horizon, just in case a scrap of scarlet snaps against the gray. Decision in the dark. One January night, a gale severs a mooring line. The North Star bangs the pier until Graham rushes out with lantern and hammer. I follow, wrapping my shawl against sleet. As we lash the boat secure, he turns, eyes raw from wind and something fiercer. I can't anchor 2 griefs at once, he murmurs. I'm going to find him. The words fall heavy as ballast. I want to argue. Storms, pirates, false leads. But another truth presses harder. Love must sometimes travel where letters cannot. We prepare. I stitch new sail patches. Graham sharpens the rigging knife's twin. The villagers donate gear, the Cooper a fresh barrel of drinking water, Mrs. Pendry a tin of honey to guard the throat, the apothecary herbs against scurvy and sleeplessness. The harbor master shakes Graham's hand, whispering, "Bring the boy home, or bring word home. Both are victories." On the eve of departure, our second farewell in as many years, I stand on the breakwater under a lantern's lonely glow. Waves slap the stones like clock hands hitting glass. The ship that once carried Leo has vanished beyond charts, but I picture its outline as clearly as if Cassian had just tipped his hat. I press the rosemary sachet against my lips, tasting salt and thyme, and release a single seed into the wind, praying it finds soil somewhere between here and there. Embarkation. Before dawn, Graham and I share porridge, thick with raisins. He shoulders a sea pack, kisses my forehead, and pauses at the door. If I find him, I'll write. If I don't, I'll search until search becomes the only language I speak. I squeeze his hand. Then I'll translate it back into hope. When you return, the tide is full. The North Star rocks impatient. He casts off as gulls scream blessing or warning. I watch until dawn swallows the lantern on her stern, the last thread of light between now and the next chapter. In the hush that follows, the cottage feels both half empty and double wide, stretched by absence. I set ink to paper, begin a record titled "Journeys Out, Journeys Home." In its pages, I will store every rumor, every whisper, every sliver of compass needle, until the sea answers. And so the second departure leaves me with two faiths, one riding the horizon on crimson sails I can no longer see, the other tacking, north by northwest under my husband's steady hand. Between them lies an ocean of stories not yet told. An ocean I vow to cross with words the way they cross with wood and canvas, until all of us stand again on the same forgiving sand. Chapter 7. The Father's Quest. The tale that follows is not mine by first-hand sight. It is stitched from the letters Graham managed to send, from the salt-stained journal he carried home in his sea chest, and from the late-night confessions he whispered once the danger had passed. I recount it here exactly as he lived it, so that every crack of twig and flicker of lantern may reach your ears as if you had walked beside him. Leaving the known sea, Graham sailed at slack tide under a dawn the color of pewter. The North Star felt too small for the task, he wrote. Yet I could not betray her with a grander vessel. He followed the channel's spine east, steering by the same constellations that had once guided Cassian's Scarlet Clipper. each mile both closing and widening the distance to Leo. 3 days out he berthed at Calais, sold half his winter catch to fund the road ahead, and shouldered a canvas pack. He left the North Star in a hired berth, oiled her spars, kissed the weathered wheel, and stepped onto cobbles that smelled of garlic, horse sweat, and foreign ink. Hardest moment yet, the journal confesses. A sailor's courage cracks when boots replace deckboards. Through the woad-blue woods. Beyond Calais, the land opened into low hills veiled by woad-blue beech woods. A peddler's map promised that a network of rivers and forest tracks would lead southeast toward the Carpathian passes, where rumors placed Cassian's troop in winter. Graham walked dawn to dusk, sleeping in shepherds' huts when weather allowed, beneath hedgerows when it did not. He met Old Man Corvin, a violinist who traded him bread and lard for 2 evenings of sea shanties. "You sing like gulls rising from a storm," Corvin wheezed, pressing a scrap of vellum into Graham's palm. "Shortcut through the wolves' wood," it read. "Avoid the toll lords." Graham thanked him, not yet guessing how dearly he would pay for that shortcut. 3 nights later in the Wolves' Wood, rain began, the sort that travels sideways, needling through cloak and soul alike. His lantern coughed out. Somewhere close, branches cracked beneath heavy paws. I remembered Leo chasing gulls along Brighton Pier. The page quivers in faded ink. The memory steadied my hands long enough to strike fresh flame. The 2-river test. Graham reached the Great Sava, a river slate green and vicious, with meltwater. No ferry ran in that season, so he found a logger's raft half buried in silt, lashed its seams with his own rigging line, and pushed off into current that roared like cannon fire. At midstream the lashings snapped. The raft spun, oar wrenched from his grip. Daylight vanished beneath churning spray. Thought of Mira, he later told me, voice raw. Imagined your laugh pinned to my coat like a compass rose. He cinched the pack across his chest and dove. Too cold even for panic, the water dragged him half a league downstream before spitting him onto stones sharp as marlin spikes. Issei lay there coughing river bile until stars replaced clouds. The second river, the Drina, he chose to ford at dawn. Ice rimmed every reed, yet the current lay calmer. He crossed barefoot, boots slung round his neck, repeating with each stumbling step, 1 pace nearer Leo, 1 pace nearer. 4. The Hermit of the Glen. Coat shredded, voice hoarse, Graham entered the foothills of the Carpathians. Snow ghosted the air, tracing silver coils through dark firs. On the fourth twilight he spied an amber coal of light, single window in a moss-roofed cottage tucked beside a frozen tarn. Inside dwelt Alwyn the seer, a woman wiry as windfall branches, eyes glittering robin egg blue. She beckoned without question, stripped Graham's cloak, and wrapped him in a wolfskin smelling of pine smoke. She brewed nettle tea black as pitch and honey thick. When warmth returned, Graham spoke Leo's name. Alwyn listened, tapping a copper spoon against her mug like a pendulum measuring grief. "I dreamed of you," she said at last, "and of a boy haloed by flame. He is not lost, merely entangled in a tower of mirrors. Reach him you can, but first you must carry 3 truths and leave 1 certainty behind." The 3 truths. Father's courage outruns a father's fear. Magic is only the world agreeing to be persuaded. A pigeon wears many feathers, but only one will glint midnight black. The certainty to relinquish? That the path home will be the same path forward. Graham, jaw tight, accepted the riddle. Alwyn pressed a heather-red blanket into his hands. For the tower's stone breathes winter. Trust its warmth more than your own. He slept by her hearth. Snow thickened outside. At dawn, she walked him to the threshold, pointed east toward peaks bearing slate teeth above cloud. The Wizard King's citadel stands there, castle of eclipsed suns. Guard your heart from every bargain but love. Then she was gone, door clicking like the close of a chapter. Up the Frostspine Pass. The slope to the Frostspine Pass rose cruel and unblazed. Graham's sea legs learned mountain rhythm, dig toe, plant heel, trust the creak of snow. Thin air rang in his ears like boats and whistles. Icicles speared from overhangs. Ravens wheeled, scattering whispers that sounded disturbingly like juggler. At a knife-edge ridge, the wind tried to peel him from the world. He crawled, on gloved knuckles, the heather blanket tied round his throat like a barbaric cape. One mismovement cost him his rigging knife, clattered into an abyss that swallowed the sound whole. Yet the ridge broke into a bowl valley where a black-walled keep jutted from rock as though the mountain had grown fangs. Gates of ironwood stood, ajar, no guards in sight. Smoke curled from arrow slits, violet against gray sky. Graham felt heat radiate. Unnatural, sulfur-tinged. He tightened the blanket, stepped through. Corridors of echo. The castle interior smelled of candle wax and old thunder. Passageways twisted without logic. Torches burned blue. He followed distant clangs, metal on stone, metal on bone, and always the echo of clinking chains beneath faint music, a melody wrought for marionettes. Down one hall he glimpsed a mural, 14 pigeons circling a black feather. Below, tiny script he could barely read. Choose the right guise to see the right soul. Alwyn's third truth flared in memory. He turned a corner and nearly collided with a man in a tailcoat the shade of tears. The stranger's eyes were night pools, but his smile shone theatrical. "Welcome, wayfarer," he purred. "Audience or applicant?" "A father," said Graham, seeking his son. The man's grin thinned. "Fathers usually unravel. Here, we shall see." He swept a mock bow and vanished behind a door that locked itself without touch. The spiral stair. At last, Graham reached a tower spiral climbing like a corkscrew into velvet dark. Each step sang underfoot. Halfway, violet light seeped through arrow loops, revealing stone etched with feather motifs. Breath hitched in his lungs, but he climbed, clutching the blanket as talisman. The stair ended in a circular chamber lit by a single brazier. 14 iron cages hung from rafters, each holding a pigeon. Some birds slept, some fluttered. All watched him with bead-black eyes. Amid their gray and pearl plumage he spied one with a lone midnight feather crest. His heart thundered. Yet voices slithered round the chamber, soft, coaxing. Any bird could be your boy. Why stake love on a scrap of ink? Choose wrong, lose all. He steadied breath, recalled Alwyn's first truth. Courage outruns fear. "I know my son," he said aloud. "No glamour can hide Leo from the man who taught him to breathe." He lifted the cage of the midnight feathered pigeon. The bars melted like frost in rising sun, and where the bird perched a moment before, now stood a young man, taller, leaner, eyes bright with stunned joy. "Father? Leo?" Graham's voice cracked open. They clutched each other, trembling, while the pigeons shrieked in silver fury. Escape down the pulse stone. Alarm bells clanged. Blue torches guttered sulfur red. Graham flung the heather blanket round Leo's shoulders and propelled him toward the stair. Stone treads rattled, chains retracted, unseen gears ground like teeth. At the foot of the tower, the tail-coated stranger reappeared, no longer smiling. "Leaving so soon?" he hissed, palm sparking eldritch flame. Graham stepped between the warlock and his son. "Only fools barter with fathers," he growled, then hurled a handful of Brighton pebbles, kept for luck, into the flame. Salt hissed, snuffing the magic. Midair. Leo seized a loose chain, swung it like bolos. The warlock staggered. Father and son bolted through collapsing halls, racing nightshade-colored shadows until, miracle of miracles, the main gate yawned before them, snowlight beckoning beyond. They plunged into the valley as the citadel throttled itself shut behind, doors clanging like coffin lids, letters in mid-journey. They did not risk the frost spine ridge again, but followed lower goat paths west. At an alpine village, they bartered Leo's silk sash for 2 shaggy ponies and winter coats. There, Graham penned the letter that finally broke my vigil. Mira, found our boy, both whole though road-torn, heading toward the Danube, rivers kinder in thaw. Keep the kettle humming. Folded inside lay the lone midnight feather, proof against doubt. Homeward horizon. They shadowed trade caravans through Hungary, hitched passage on a grain barge to Vienna, then a coal steamer to Calais. At each port, Leo performed small wonders, balancing mugs on lute strings, flipping coins over dozing dogs, to pay fares and lift trudging spirits. Graham recorded town's gratitude in tidy script. The world loves miracles most when they cost nothing. At last, Brighton's lighthouse pierced an April dawn. I stood on the pier, rosemary blooming in my apron pocket, when the North Star glided in. Graham's beard had frosted to silver. Leo's eyes held storms and starlight both. They crossed the gangplank as one, ship cat trailing, journal thumping against Graham's ribs, tower echoes still faint in Leo's breath. I kissed them both, pressed palms to foreheads, counted heartbeats, 2 steady drums answering mine. Behind us gulls wheeled, before us cottage windows flushed gold. Somewhere far east, a black-walled keep cooled to granite silence, but its shadow no longer reached our shore. Thus ended the father's quest, not in trumpet blast or coin shower, but in 3 figures linking arms along a familiar quay, choosing hearthlight over legend for one clear morning. Yet legends rarely rest long, and the echoes of that tower would one day call again. But that belongs to another chapter, and another turning of the tide. Chapter 8. The Hermit of the Glen. Smoke was the first sign that hope still lived in the valley. A thin silver braid curling above spruce tops, too deliberate to be drifting mist. Graham saw it moments after he and Leo scrambled out of the blizzard-bitten pass, and he steered them toward the scent of peat as a sailor trims toward harbor lights. Behind them, the Wizard King's fortress had already folded into the clouds, but the chill of its stone still shuddered in their bones. Leo staggered more, then walked, The escape had cost him. The iron rung that snapped beneath his boot had sliced a shallow crescent across his calf, and the whip of winter wind had etched ice burns along his cheeks. Graham wrapped the heather-red blanket tighter around his son's shoulders, murmuring the old dockside cadence he had used when Leo was a child rocked by nightmares. "Easy now, lad, easy. One foot, then the other." The glen opened like a bowl scooped out of the mountain's palm. In its hollow squatted a cottage barely larger than a fishing shanty, roof sunken beneath a quilt of moss and snow. A single mullioned window glowed, amber. Curling their fingers around what little courage they still possessed, father and son made for the door. The cottage of thousand smells, Olwen the seer, hermit, healer, keeper of riddles, answered before they had time to knock. Candlelight flared behind her wiry frame, turning her hair into a coronal of silver threads. She said nothing at first, only scanned Leo head to toe, her eyes sharp as all points yet warm at the edges. "Come," she ordered, voice rasping like parchment turned too often. Storm frost bites deepest once victory loosens the ribs. Inside, the one-room cottage sang with aromas: spruce resin, dried juniper, beeswax, rabbit broth, and something sweeter, anise perhaps, or memory itself distilled. Bundles of herbs hung from ceiling beams. Books taller than bricks leaned in precarious stacks. A black kettle hissed over the hearth, every bubble a promise. She pointed Leo to a three-legged stool and pulled off the sodden blanket. Quick fingers slit his trouser leg, revealing the cut. From a tin she scooped green salve that smelled of rain on mint and pressed it into the wound. Leo winced. Steam seemed to rise from his skin. "Will it scar?" he asked through clenched teeth. "Scars are the signatures of choices," Olwen replied. "Some signatures you keep to remember the contract." Graham crouched nearby, fidgeting as though the salve stung him instead. Only when Olwen handed him a mug of broth did he unclench. "You saved us before we began," he told her, voice hoarse. "And now again." Olwen's smile held equal parts mischief and melancholy. "Guidance is a lantern. You still walked the dark." Night of questions and embers. When Leo could stand without swaying, Olwen ushered both men toward the hearth. They sat on bearskin rugs while she ladled broth into wooden bowls. Outside, wind worried at the shutters. Inside, flames popped pine sap fireworks. Graham's first question arrived like a stone dropped into a pond. "Why help strangers twice? What stake have you in a Fisher family's troubles?" Olwen threaded her fingers. once I swore fealty to the court of mirrors. That same wizard king who netted your son? In my youth I believed beauty of skill justified theft of freedom. Then I watched a troop of children juggle sunlight between their palms only to be caged for the pleasure of a crown. I fled. Since then, whenever that citadel casts its net, I untie one knot if I can. She turned to Leo, gauging him not as an invalid but as a compass newly magnetized. Tell me, Fire Child, what song did the chains in that tower sing to you? Leo's gaze drifted to the rafters. They whispered that applause is worth any price. And do you still believe it? He shook his head. Not if the price is my father's heartbeat or my mother's tea waiting to warm. Alwyn nodded once, teacher satisfied with a pupil's unprompted answer. A map of feathers and roads. From beneath her cot she withdrew a roll of vellum and spread it on the table. A map, but unlike any Graham had studied. Rivers shimmered. Silver. Mountain ridges glowed faint violet. Blank spaces pulsed dull red. These veins mark power, not topography, Alwyn explained. Every juggler, every bard, every teller of impossible tales draws unknowingly from them. The Wizard King hunts along the largest currents. He will feel tonight's loss. Graham scowled. Let him feel it all the way to his marrow. Anger is heat without navigation, Alwyn cautioned. She tapped a turquoise thread snaking west. Follow this until water tastes of salt. It avoids both his spies and the winter wolves. 3 villages will offer refuge. Tell them the Hermit of the Glen still remembers the flute. Leo leaned over the map. And when we reach the coast? The sea sings a language even crowns cannot silence, she said, eyes flicking toward Graham. Sail home, then decide if your harbor is enough to anchor the storm that follows gift and grief side by side. The Hearthside Confession. Later, when broth was replaced by mulled elder wine, Leo dozed on the bearskin, cheeks flushed pink with returning warmth. Graham lingered near the embers. Alwyn joined him, unbearably gentle. You fear losing him again, she said. I fear my own heart's contradictions, he answered. I wanted him safe more than anything, and yet let him sail twice. Love keeps opening its fist, and every time I watch it fly, I bleed. Alwyn laid a cedar-smelling hand on his elbow. Some children are arrows, some are harpoons. Arrows must fly to find their mark, but they can return if the bow remembers its part. Harpoons dive deep and tie back to the boat by rope. Your son is both flight and tether. Respect both halves, and neither will break. Graham swallowed, tasting ash and forgiveness all at once. Gifts for the road. Just before dawn, Alwyn packed a satchel for them. Jars of honey wax salve, packets of smoked venison, and a linen pouch of starflowers whose petals glow faintly in darkness. Steep these when spirits falter, she advised. Dreams will burn clear again. To Leo, she gave a single obsidian marble veined with silver. Drop it only when cornered. It will remind your enemies that the ground beneath them also juggles. To Graham, she gave a hickory staff capped with whalebone. For walking and for drawing lines, no man may cross unless invited. Finally, she refolded the map and sealed it with green wax. Melt the seal only after the third village. Trust, then verify. Departure through crystal air. Sunrise fractured across the tarn, making ice shards blush rose and gold. Leo's limp had eased, though he still leaned on his father's shoulder. The hermit walked them to the edge of her spruce ring, breath-puffing dragon pearls. "Will we meet again?" Leo asked. Alwyn shrugged, smile secret. "The world is a wheel. If you keep rolling, every spoke finds the hub sooner or later." Graham bowed, an awkward seaman's bow. "Your hearth will be marked in our logbook for as long as ink holds. And your family will be the answer I give when asked whether miracles survive their makers," she replied. With that, she turned back to her cottage, already half missed against morning glare. Father and son followed the turquoise thread of river, boots crunching frost, hearts warmed by blankets, salve, and the knowledge that some strangers carry more kinship than blood can name. Footprints fade, stories remain. By noon, the cottage chimney had disappeared behind the slope, yet its smoke curled on in their minds. Leo practiced gentle tosses of the obsidian marble, letting sunlight wink off its veins. Graham tested the hickory staff's weight, finding a rhythm that matched the cadence of seagulls hidden hundreds of leagues west. Neither spoke for many miles. Words felt too small beside the trust the hermit had shown. Trust that they would guard their own light now that a new lantern had been handed over. That night they camped under a sky scraped raw by stars. Leo brewed the starflowers. The tea glowed palest sapphire. They drank, and dreams came swift but untroubling. Mira at the garden gate, Rosemary in her apron, 3 gulls spiraling above the harbor bell. Somewhere, faintly, a woman's voice offered a final riddle to the wind. Paths part, paths braid, but the Glen remembers every footfall. When dawn returned, the coals of their campfire pulsed ember red, the exact shade of a heather blanket that lay folded at the foot of their bedrolls smelling of pine smoke. ready for the miles still waiting to be walked. Thus ends the chapter of the Hermit of the Glen, where guidance clothed itself in nettle tea and cedar wisdom, and where a father and son learned that safe passage is more than escape. It is the art of carrying someone else's faith across the threshold still to come. Chapter 9. The Challenge of Feathers. The hermit's glen faded behind fir trunks and frost-white ferns, yet her warning, "The wizard king will feel tonight's loss," echoed in every crunch of snow beneath our boots. River mist wrapped the valley in shifting gauze, and somewhere inside that dimness we sensed a counterspell already gathering its threads. First village, first feather. By sunset we reached Thistledown, the tiny hamlet Alwyn had marked as the map's first refuge. Roofs were thatched in heather, chimneys coughing wood smoke sweet with apple peel. We offered the password she had taught us. The hermit still remembers the flute, to a wary innkeeper. His suspicion melted. He ushered us to a loft room tight as a ship's forecastle but warm. During supper, a traveling peddler unrolled baubles for sale. Among trinkets gleamed a pewter brooch shaped like a feather, its vein etched in night-colored enamel. Something about the angle of its barbs stirred unease. It matched, stroke for stroke, the midnight plume that had once distinguished Leo's cage in the tower. The peddler claimed he'd found it on the road. Graham bought nothing, but that night he lay awake turning the coincidence over like a stone that refused to show its underside. At dawn, the brooch was gone from the common table, and the peddler with it. The Carnival of Plumer. 2 days. March east. A road of rime-crusted flagstones led to Briarwick, the second village named on Olwen's chart. Snowfall had softened to dry powder that hissed beneath each step. As we arrived, bright banners whipped above the square. Carnival of Plumer, one night only. Stalls sprouted like mushrooms, silks shimmering, puppets cavorting, fiddles sawing, jigs that made even the mayor's dour hound tap a paw. Yet every banner shared a motif: feathers, painted, gilded, even stitched in reel down, floating around bold letters. Leo's gaze narrowed. "Plumer means feather in old Occitan," he whispered. "Too tidy a coincidence." At dusk, townsfolk crowded a canvas pavilion rimmed with lantern globes. We slipped inside, meltwater dripping from cloaks. The ringmaster, masked by a plume fan, stepped into the gaslight. His voice, smooth, syrup-slow, spoke of wonders airy as angels, sharp as talons. He produced a lacquer box, snapped the lid, and released 14 ivory feathers that rose on unseen currents, circling over our heads like ghostly gulls. "Choose the one that carries truth," he purred, "and destiny bends to your hand." The audience giggled, assuming parlor trick. Leo's knuckles whitened. He leaned close to my ear. "Those feathers aren't wood. They're memory. I feel the tower inside them." The ringmaster glided down the aisle, fan hiding half a grin. "Young master," he said to Leo, "care to test your fortune?" Without waiting for assent, he extended an ebony tray. The circling feathers settled in a perfect wheel upon it. Every quill identical, save that one bore a fleeting dark sheen when it skimmed the lamplight, like oil atop water. Olwen's third truth returned. Only one will glint midnight black. Leo reached, but my hand shot forward first. I snatched the midnight feather, fist closing as if on a coal. The pavilion lamps guttered. Cold surged up my wrist, but I held fast. On stage, the ringmaster's fan sagged. For a breath, his mask slipped, revealing eyes of molten copper. The Wizard King's. Emissary gasps burst around us. Children shrieked. The emissary hissed a curse, feathers scattering in vortex. Leo flung Olwen's obsidian marble. When it struck the plank floor, it cracked like thunder, splitting the illusion. Feathers dissolved to ash. The emissary recoiled, melting into smoke that fled beneath the tent wall. Briarwick's revelers stared, stunned. We bowed clumsily, claimed no explanation, and vanished into night before questions could root. Unlocking the wax-sealed map Olwen's instructions. Break the seal after the third village. Briarwick counted as the second, yet the emissary's ambush convinced us to consult the map sooner. Beneath a pine lean-to, we melted the green wax with Leo's tinder spark. Fresh ink bled across parchment, lines redrawing themselves into a labyrinth of feather glyphs. In one corner, a quill-shaped arrow pointed toward the coast. In another, a couplet appeared. When black feather greets its kin, path opens out by folding in. I traced the arrow to a crossroads icon labeled simply, the Aviary Gate. The route forked there. One spur led south toward a port. The other looped into marshland blank as unlit paper. The emissary will expect us on the straight road, Leo reasoned. Better we vanish into the marsh than surface downstream. So marsh it was, though neither of us savored trudging through iced reeds humming with unseen life. The river of mirrors. The marsh spat us onto a glassy tributary feeding the Danube. Drift ice drifted like serrated plates. No bridge spanned the water, but an oarless ferry barge waited at a mossy quay, its prow figurehead, a heron winging skyward, held in lieu of gemstone eye, a stub of dark glass. Leo pried at it, a black feather etched into smoky quartz. Third feather, I murmured. Another test. We pushed the barge off. Midstream, fog thickened to mirror every motion, a duplicate world sailing beside ours. Then the water itself began reflecting impossible images. Brighton's harbor, Mira waving a tea-stained apron, Cassian's clipper ablaze with morning light. Voices called, "Come home, Graham! Perform with us, Leo!" Hallucination tugged at sinew and memory alike. The barge yawed toward phantom docks. I remembered Alwyn's first truth. Courage outruns fear. I lifted the midnight feather, its vein now rigid as steel, and plunged it into the river. A ring of darkness rippled outward, shredding the visions like paint and solvent. Water returned to dull slate. Fog thinned. The ferry grounded on the opposite. We had crossed from memory's snare into uncharted quiet. The aviary gate. Late next day, we reached a stone archway bridging a stream scarcely wider than a boot. Carved along its curve, 14 pigeon wings in flight, each feathered plume chiseled with manic devotion. At the keystone, a hollow as if awaiting tribute. Leo's wound twinged. He steadied himself with the hickory staff. "This must be the gate," he said. I set the midnight feather into the hollow. It clicked, then liquefied, seeping along carved wings like ink in parchment. The archstones brightened to dawn white, and the stream beneath shimmered gold. A path unfurled beyond, crushed shells sparkling in moonlight though the moon had not yet risen. We stepped through. Warm wind, scent of kelp and salt, kissed our faces. Far ahead, gulls cried. Return of the scarlet sails. We emerged onto a cliff overlooking tiered coves where winter sea rolled cobalt and foam. Below, at anchor, bobbed the North Star, Graham's own cutter. But tied alongside, sails furled, towered the clipper of crimson cloth and golden spars, Cassian's vessel. Lanterns dotted her rigging like captive stars. A small dinghy cut across the cove, rowed by a figure whose silhouette I knew by heart. Mira, shawl-whipped, eyes bright against sea wind. Word of our course, carried by Alwyn's unseen couriers, had reached home. She leapt ashore, arms around both of us before breath found voice. Salt tears tasted of every river we'd forded. Above us, Cassian hailed, hat over heart. Wariness flickered in Leo's eyes, but Cassian called, "The Wizard King's reach ends where family begins. May I parley?" we climbed the ship's ladder. On deck, Cassian set a chest between us. Inside lay 14 feathers, each midnight black, bridled by silver thread. "Souls the wizard stole," he said softly. "He cannot reclaim them if their keeper lives free. Choose where they find peace, sky burial at sunrise or sanctuary in Brighton. The decision belongs to the one he wronged most." Leo lifted the feathers, voice trembling. "They will see. The sea, then the sky." Cassian nodded, an apprentice's salute to his student's command. Homeward Featherfall. At dawn we rowed to open water. Leo stood on the dinghy's stern, scattered the feathers one by one. Sea breeze caught them. Each flared silver, then dissolved into winged sparks that arced sunward and were gone. When the last vanished, gulls wheeled overhead in sudden exuberant chorus. "The challenge is answered," Cassian whispered. "No more tests hidden in plumes." But Leo turned to me and Mira. "Feathers will still cross our path. We now know how to read their flight." We sailed west. Cassian's ship accompanied us as far as the headland, then dipped crimson sails and veered south, seeking stages unshadowed by tyranny. The North Star, humbler but surer, bore us the final miles. Brighton's lighthouse burned welcoming gold. Rosemary flashed green on cliff gardens. When our keel scraped home sand, children rushed to seize Leo's hands, begging stories. He laughed, juggling 3 shells without thought, the simplest fall of objects now richer for every high wire. Every midnight plume survived. I gazed at Mira, at Leo, at the gull that drifted overhead, dropping a single white feather onto the deck. Ordinary feather, no midnight sheen, yet never again would I see such gifts as mere drift. Coda, ink on calm water. That evening I opened my weather-worn journal and wrote the date across a fresh page. Beneath it I inked a single line, a father's. Courage and a son's fire have returned every feather to flight. The sea outside our window lay calm, but my pen knew storms concede navigation just as surely as tragedy seeds triumph. For somewhere, beyond friendly horizons, new threads of wind were already twisting into tale. And when they blew, we would listen, not with fear, but with the practiced ears of those who have faced the challenge of feathers and learned that sometimes the only way to keep hold of what you love is to set it truly free. Chapter 10. Homeward Flight. I begin this final chapter with the smell of salt and baking bread drifting in from the open window. The same 2 scents that greeted a cradle once adrift on our tide. How many dawns have turned since then? Enough. For a fisher and his wife to outwait 2 fears and welcome 2 returns. Enough for a boy to trade driftwood balls for flaming torches, yet still keep his pockets full of Brighton pebbles. Now, at last, the story circles back to the harbor where every wave still remembers his name. The Lantern Path. We sighted the lighthouse just after midnight, its beam sweeping slow and patient across the ink-black water. Leo was at the tiller of the North Star, Graham on the mainsheet, and I sat in the prow listening to gulls already waking on the pier. Cassian's crimson clipper had bowed away 2 days earlier, leaving us with clear skies and a lengthening hush that tasted of closure. As the tide carried us through the channel markers, neighbors appeared along the breakwater, lanterns raised like a constellation transplanted to earth. Old Mrs. Pendry waved an embroidered kerchief. Young Tom the Cooper balanced on a bollard, shouting that the town brass band had tuned itself since dawn, just in case. When our keel kissed the landing, 40 hands caught the gunwale and lifted us the final inches. Boots thumped hollow on planks, ropes flew, a whistle cut the night, and Brighton exhaled a single jubilant cheer. Leo stood motionless, eyes shining wide enough to hold the whole scene. Then he leapt onto the pier and kissed the timbers, laughter cracking open the silence that had followed. Him from the mountains. Graham climbed after, slower, but when his feet found solid wood, he staggered only once before catching me in his arms. I felt his beard against my cheek, smelled river moss and smoke from the Hermit's hearth still tangled in his coat, and knew our circle had closed. A cottage restitched. Home required tending after its long vigil. The shutters clacked. Loose, rosemary had overgrown the path, and the gulls had claimed the eaves with the entitlement of petty monarchs. Yet the kettle still whistled true, and within an hour the hearth glowed bright enough to chase mountain frost from Leo's bones. Graham stacked driftwood juggling balls on the mantel. Leo set the obsidian marble beside them, a tiny, silent reminder that miracles and danger sometimes share the same glint. That night, we 3 slept in our own beds for the first time in seasons. No wind shrieked beyond stone keep or rigging. Only the low hush of a familiar tide tiptoeing toward shore. I dreamed of feathers dissolving into sunrise, and of Alwyn smiling somewhere far upstream, her kettle rattling a benediction. Return, rebuild, relearn. Morning unveiled tasks both. Humble and healing, Graham oiled the North Star's rigging. Leo and I revarnished the kitchen table scarred by months of map ink and worry. When word spread that the Wells family was whole again, townsfolk arrived bearing gifts, a basket of early strawberries, a bolt of sailcloth, a brass oil lamp shaped like a gull. Each offering felt less like charity than a pledge. Your story is ours now. Let us hold a corner of its weight. Leo's limp faded within a week under the balm of sea air and Alwyn's salve. He salvaged pine slats from a storm-broken pier and built a low practice stage between the cottage and the beach, just wide enough for a wire rig, 2 silk anchors, and a rope tensed like the curve of a smile. Children clustered every afternoon to watch him drill footwork, clubs flashing in sunlight. He refused payment beyond laughter and questions, both of which the children paid eagerly. Yet not every moment shone. Some nights I found him on the breakwater, eyes fixed on the dark horizon where the Wizard King's fortress lay hidden beyond memory. "If tyranny can reach this far once," he whispered, "what keeps it from trying again?" I had no tidy answer, only the same truth Alwyn taught us. A lantern's job is not to stop the dark, but to prove it can be pushed back an arm's length at a time. For Brighton's Midsummer Tide Fest. In late June, the mayor proposed a new celebration, Tide Fest, honoring the harbor's resilience and the miracle-laden journey that had ended on its planks. A committee asked Leo to headline the evening show. Graham to coordinate a flotilla of lantern boats, me to oversee culinary comforts, which adults knew meant tea enough for an army, and children knew meant my rosemary honey cakes. Preparation spun the town into delighted chaos. We strung bunting from mast to mast. Fishermen hammered a floating stage onto 2 linked barges. The blacksmith fashioned miniature lighthouses as torch stands. Everywhere, feathers, a symbol reclaimed, appeared in painted murals, sewn onto sashes, carved into pastries. On the solstice evening, gulls wheeled under peach-colored sky while tide echo thumped against hulls. Leo stepped onto the stage clad in simple linen, hair tied back with a strip of crimson sail. No velvet, no mirrors, no pyrotechnics, just a coil of blue silk, 3 brass-capped clubs, and a promise. He began with silence, wrapping the silk around his waist like a climbing line. Then he ran, took 3 quick strides up the taut rope, and flipped backward to hang upside down, arms spread. Gasps rippled across the cove. He spoke, voice steady, rolling over water. Every gift comes with a shadow. But look, friends, how bright the gift shows when we dare lift it higher than fear. He rose, weightless, spinning slowly as the silk unraveled. Mid-descent, he released the clubs. 1, 2, 3, catching them in a pattern that traced a feather's curve through air. Each time a club struck its zenith, a lantern boat behind. The stage lit aflame, until 14 boats formed a halo of flickering halos around him. The final club flew skyward. He followed in a whipcord leap, seized it, and dropped to one knee on the deck as the boat's reflections rippled gold across his skin. Silence held, not stunned, but reverent, then shattered into applause that rattled windows. I wept openly. Graham's palms reddened from clapping. Leo bowed just once, then beckoned every child to the stage for a turn at silks or wire, declaring, "Marvels multiply when shared." By midnight, even the mayor hung upside down, coattails flapping, dignity abandoned to wild laughter. Tidefest ended with fireworks whose sparks traced gull wings above the lighthouse, and rumors spread that the festival would return each year, so long as the sea remembers how to breathe. 5 letters from wider seas. Cassian kept his pledge to write. A courier ship arrived monthly with a packet of letters, some penned in his sweeping charcoal script, others by Aurora, Izumi, Naima, or Jax. They spoke of crowded piazzas and moonlit temples, of audiences shocked into stillness by newly freed tricks. With each envelope came pressed petals from foreign flowers or charcoal sketches of rooftops our eyes had never seen. One midsummer letter contained only a single sentence, the Wizard King's castle now stands abandoned. Tyrants fear silence more than swords. Alongside it lay a parchment seal emblazoned with a broken crown of feathers, proof that revolt had sediment beyond rumor. Leo folded the seal into his journal without comment, though that night he slept the unbroken sleep of someone who trusts. Morning. When work feels like play. Autumn carried routine like driftwood to our door. Graham resumed fishing at dawn. Not for commerce, but for pleasure and for teaching Brighton's orphans how to tie bowlines. Leo alternated between boat days, juggling workshops, and a new project, crafting a small traveling troupe of local youths who wished to taste the stage without leaving behind their sky or kin. He named them Shoreflight Company, explaining that a bird may leave the nest daily and still claim it at dusk. I reopened my mother's long-shuttered tea shop, the Cradle and Compass, where fishermen swapped stories and visitors squinted at shelves crammed with feathers, driftwood balls, and a marbled stone said to burst thunder if struck. Nobody dared test it. On slow afternoons, Leo performed improvised sets on the boardwalk, drawing tourists who left coins and, more importantly, news of far-off tides. Graham sometimes worried that Leo might yet feel the pull of distant spires. But Leo's answer remained, "My stories travel farther than I do now, and that is voyage enough." An ordinary miracle. One rain-washed January evening, just after the lamps were lit, a knock sounded. On the threshold stood a teenager in patched coat, juggling 3 apples with hesitant skill. He stammered that he'd run from a cruel workhouse and followed rumors of a harbor where a conjurer turned feathers into freedom. Leo welcomed him in, fetched a dry shirt, and placed an apple in the boy's steadying palm. "First lesson," he said, "is that dropping an apple isn't failure. It's proof you tried something gravity didn't expect." The boy smiled, relief blooming like sunrise. Watching them, I understood Alwyn's final riddle. Paths part, paths braid, but the Glen remembers. Our Glen, the harbor, now echoed with new footfalls, each seeking their own map of trust, magic, and return. And so Brighton continued the ancient work of villages everywhere, turning strangers into neighbors, neighbors into guardians of the next impossible dream. Epilogue by Lamplight. I close my journal on an autumn night flavored with wood smoke and distant fiddle. Leo has just come in from rehearsal. Graham finishes cleaning nets, though tomorrow's forecast is calm. I add a final entry. Miracles did not end with flight. They landed, nested, and now hatch more miracles by the dozen. Homeward flight, then, is no single arc but a constellation of smaller journeys, each feathered by risk, yet buoyed by return. May our harbor remain wide enough for them all. Outside, the tide purrs against pilings, same as always. Yet every ripple feels rewritten. Proof that the sea can cradle more than loss, that a child found in drifting reeds may one day redirect a kingdom's shadow, and that a father's quest can teach an entire coast to measure bravery not by distance traveled, but by love carried home. Tomorrow morning I'll sweep the porch, tie rosemary bundles for steeping, and perhaps mend a juggler's torn cuff while he recounts a dream. Routine, yes, yet through its seams glimmers the knowledge that wonder lives. Comfortable now, beside the ordinary. This is how legends take their rest. Not in silence, but in the soft chorus of gulls, kettle, and the sure swing of a lantern that will guide the next voyager to shore. So ends the homeward flight, anchored, yet forever winged. Great work today. Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.